So I know this is a Rails conference, but I'm guessing many of you, like me, occasionally spend at least some time writing JavaScript. And so I thought it might be nice for all of us to get a little bit more familiar with some of the nitty-gritty about how JavaScript works. And specifically, we're going to talk about addition. So when I was writing this talk, I did what any programmer would do, and I Googled JavaScript addition. And literally the third hit was this rather poignant Stack Overflow post that says, "Addition is not working in JavaScript." And here's this poor person. They're trying to learn JavaScript, and they're doing what they think should be a fairly straightforward thing, just trying to add two numbers together. And they're getting an unexpected result. 2 plus 2 equals 22, 5 plus 7 equals 57. And they're especially confused because division, multiplication, and subtraction are all working just fine, but somehow addition is not. I really felt for this person because this is legit, right? Here they are trying to do some simple addition, and JavaScript is violating every expectation they have about how math works. And it's not just beginners who feel this way. This is a slide from Gary Bernhardt's Lightning Talk What, which if you haven't seen, I highly recommend. And it's basically 4 minutes of him pointing out a bunch of really ridiculous things in JavaScript and Ruby that seem to make no sense, including this rather bizarre math. So I watched this talk, and I felt kind of like Jeff Cummin. I felt kind of like this. Fortunately, the talk does not end here, because once I got over my total crogglement, I decided, you know what, somewhere buried inside this language, there is a reason JavaScript acts this way. So we're going to go on a little adventure with our friend Donald Duck here, and we're going to figure this out. So hi, I'm Meara. I live here in Chicago. That's my Twitter handle, and I work at a consultancy called TableXI. So before we go too deep into the internals of how JavaScript handles math, we probably want to be clear on what the things are that we're doing math with. So we're just going to go through a quick overview of the basics just to make sure we're all on the same page. So we're going to learn about object types. There's a few different kinds. And JavaScript has 6 primitive types, which are basically the building blocks of the language, and we're just going to speed through them. So the first is a Boolean. A Boolean can be only one of two things, true or false. We also have numbers. And in JavaScript, we don't really distinguish between integers and non-integers. And we also have a few special things. So we've got plus and minus infinity, which for the purposes of this talk, we're not going to worry about. And then we also have this thing called not a number, which is what this nan up there stands for. Fun fact, if you call type of on not a number, you get number, which is hilarious. Thanks, JavaScript. It's not a number, but it's a number. So we also have strings, which are pretty much anything you put in quotes. And of course, there are objects which can contain both data and behavior. So objects can have a lot of stuff in them, like this one, or they can be empty, which we would represent by a pair of curly brackets. Null represents nothing, which is different from undefined, which is what you get when you have declared a variable in your scope, but you never actually set a value. JavaScript also has a bunch of different types of data structures, but for the purposes of this talk, we only need to worry about one, which is array. So an array you can think of as a collection, and it can be a collection of all of one type of thing, like this array of integers, or it can be a bunch of different things like the second example. So let's do some math. So let's try adding some numbers and strings. So I've got a few examples here. What do we think the JavaScript engine is going to give us when we give it 2 plus 2? Just shout it out. 4. Okay, we got 4. How about apples plus bananas? Apples, bananas. You guys are rock stars. All right, how about string 2 plus string 2? 22. Okay. It was a little confusing there, but yes, we did get 22. So this is an interesting thing. So we can see from those examples we just did that plus actually means 2 different things. So the first one is number addition, which hopefully we're all familiar with. And the other is called string concatenation, which is basically what you get when you take 2 or more smaller strings and smush them together to make one bigger string. So all right, we're feeling pretty good. So let's try something a little more interesting. So what happens if we add numbers and strings to each other? What do we think is going to happen with this first example here, string 2 plus number 2? 22. Okay. Sorry, tab too fast. As we can see, it doesn't actually matter what order we're going in. And how about 2 plus apples? 2 apples. So this is interesting. Like, even though we might expect that we're calling a method on a string, in the first example of string 2 plus number 2, and the second one we're calling a method on an integer, but we're still doing string addition. So that's interesting. So the way that it's doing this is called through something called coercion. So we never actually told JavaScript that we wanted to convert anything to a string. It basically just looked at the expression that we gave it and said, I think you're trying to do a string thing. It looks like you want a string, and so it gave us one, which is very helpful and also quite magical and possibly very confusing. So at this point, we've got enough data to come up with kind of a working model of addition in JavaScript. And so this is the model that I've come up with. So for the expression a plus b, if either a or b is a string, we're going to do string concatenation with coercion if necessary. And otherwise, if both a and b are not strings, we're doing number addition. So at this point, I'm feeling kind of like this. We've got this great model. We're totally rocking and rolling here. So let's try something a little more interesting. What if I want to add other things? So these are a little different. What do you think we'll get, or what might you want to get out of this first example up here, summing these 2 arrays? Okay, we might want a larger array of the numbers 1 through 6. That would be nice, right? Let's see what JavaScript actually gives us. Okay. All right. How about the second example here, true plus true? Okay, we got false, we got 2, all right. 2. Okay, how about undefined plus null? Okay, we got a lot of different answers here. Not a number is what we're gonna get. Null plus null? We got some nulls, we got some zeros. 0. How about empty array plus empty object? Exception. Oh, I would love exception. That'd be great. We get the string representation of an object. How about the opposite way? What if we do empty object plus empty array? What do we think we're going to get? Okay, sounds like we're kind of thinking string object. Maybe we're not sure. 0. What? So at this point, I'm feeling a little more like this. Like, what is going on? What is even happening? It's getting a little scary here. But okay, we're going to hit the books. We're going to do some math, and we're going to figure out what the heck is going on. So the authoritative source for what the heck is going on with JavaScript is the ECMAScript Specification, which is a very long document put out by the people who wrote the language about how JavaScript is supposed to behave. So let's see what the ECMAScript specs tell us about the addition operator. This is a lot of text. You don't have to read all of this because I have helpfully boiled it down to the definition that we're going to see on the next 2 slides. So this is a little bit of a modified version of our earlier model. So for the expression a plus b, if either a or b is a string, or its primitive's default value is a string, which is something that we're going to learn about soon, we're going to do string concatenation, and if we need to coerce either of our operands to a string, we're just going to go ahead and do that. Otherwise, if both a and b are not strings, we're going to do number addition, and again, if we need to do coercion here, we're just going to go for it. All right, so this is great. So now we have our model. So let's go back to our examples from before and seeing if we can figure out where we're getting these results. So I don't know about you, but none of these operands on the left really look like strings to me. So I'm going to assume we're going to try and do number addition first. So let's try that. So here we have the table that the ECMAScript specs provide for us on how to convert these things to numbers. So undefined goes to not a number. Null goes to +0. If you're wondering if there is a -0, yes, there is. Why is there a -0? I don't know. A Boolean goes to 1 if it's true and 0 if it's false. Numbers are already numbers, so they just stay the same. Strings we're never going to have to worry about. And objects are a little more complicated, so we're going to worry about that a little later. I think we've already learned some useful things. So if we go back here, take our little knowledge and do some math. We have true plus true. That turns into 1 plus 1, so we get 2. That makes sense. Undefined and null, we have not a number plus 0, which is not a number. 0 and 0 is 0, so we've got 3 out of our 6 examples here kind of figured out. But we've still got these other problem children. So let's go back to the first part of our definition. So if either A or B is a string, or its primitive's default value is a string. So before I condense this definition, literally the first 6 or 7 steps of this are how to determine if A or B is a string or should be treated like one. And it turns out the first thing we need to do is call this theoretical method toPrimitive on our operands. And so this is how that works. This is the table of the conversions. And sort of unsurprisingly, if anything is a primitive, calling to primitive on it doesn't change it, it stays as a primitive. For objects, it's a little more complicated, and so we need to do something which is to call this default value method on our object. So let's go look at that. Yeah, this is super fun, right? So basically what this does is it takes an object and it tries to turn it into a number or a string. And for the way it's being called with addition, it's going to try and turn it into a string first. So basically almost any kind of object, including arrays, is going to be treated as though it is a string. So if we go back to our examples, here with this first array, we know arrays should be treated as strings, so we coerce them into strings. Now we have an expression that looks not too scary. We know how to do string concatenation, and so we get this result. For another one of our examples, we've got empty array plus empty object. Empty array goes to an empty string. Empty object goes to the string representation of itself. And again, we do string concatenation, nothing too crazy going on here. So this is great. We've got 5 out of our 6 examples figured out, but we've still got this one little weird thing going on here at the bottom. So what's going on here? Turns out there's more. There's something I didn't tell you, something JavaScript doesn't make super obvious, I think, which is that plus casts anything to a number. So literally all you have to do if you want a number is prefix it with the plus symbol, and it will turn into a number. So at this point, I'm feeling kind of like this, like what is happening, what is reality? I don't even know, it's just total madness. So we go back to our example here, empty object plus empty array. I'm still not quite seeing how we get to 0. And yeah, it turns out there's one more gotcha, which is this pair of curly braces. This whole talk, I've been referring to this as an empty object. That's what I think this is. That's certainly what I intended this to be. But it turns out this notation is ambiguous. This pair of brackets can represent an empty object. It can also represent an empty block. Yeah. And so a block, as we know, is just a group of code, which means an empty block is just a group of code that does nothing. So what happens when we see this expression, or when the JavaScript engine sees it rather, it says, oh hey, okay, so we got this piece of code that does nothing, and then we're casting an array to a number. Hooray! I guess we're going to give you 0. And that is what it does in Chrome and Safari. In Firefox, it does something else. So, yay. This is fantastic. But what about our poor friend on Stack Overflow? Have we solved their problem? Why is addition so different? And it turns out if we go back to the ECMAScript spec, this is the spec for multiplicative operations, multiplication, division, and modulo. And subtraction, you're just going to have to trust me, follows the same pattern. And so we see here, this is a lot shorter, actually, and there's no conditional branching here. So no matter what your input looks like, if you're doing division or multiplication or modulo, whatever, you are always going to be doing it with numbers. So you are always going to coerce two numbers. You don't have to decide if you should do string multiplication, because that concept is not implemented in JavaScript. So that's pretty much all we've got time for. But before I go, I just want to say thanks to all these lovely people who helped this talk come to be, and my company, TableXI. And if you have any questions or anything you want to learn more about, these are great resources. The You Don't Know JS book series is fantastic. I really recommend it. And Mathmagic Land's on YouTube, so check it out. Thanks.